It's Lisa from Been There, Got Out. I am super excited for today's guest because he has become a good friend. We've actually even stayed in his home on vacation last year. He is David Morneau, and there he is. Let me get you on, David. Our book that came out last year. We've done presentations together in person as well as online here. David, you gotta turn your camera around. It's been a while. There you go.
Yeah, no, the camera was turned around. It's not turned around in Instagram land. So
Okay, okay.
whenever it comes on, and of course my headphones aren't working, so I'm going by the phone. But
That's
that's
okay.
we're
That's
used to the
okay.
technical difficulties.
That's okay. That's okay. So I was just saying how we've known each other, and you wrote the foreword to our book, and we've done presentations in person. And my family has vacationed in your home before, which is so much fun. So it's great to have you back on. It's been a while since we've done one of our little group client as consumer, but I know you and I always stay in touch regularly. And so I was thinking that you would be the perfect person to talk to about fear and how this relates to getting out of it during a perpetual state of fear in particular, when you have to negotiate with a difficult person, since all of our clients are usually overwhelmed and terrified, and they're trying to get out of these very difficult relationships. And many of them say, I can't negotiate with a terrorist. I don't even want to participate. I'm just going to hand it over to my lawyer and then let them take charge. But before we start, because I know there's no question that I can get a short answer from, let me have you introduce yourself first, and then we can just get into it.
I mean, before we get started, Lisa, it's always a pleasure to go live with you. It's always a pleasure to speak with you when we're not live in between. I think our relationship has grown, and one of the things that I've done, so I'm a family lawyer, been a family lawyer for 25 years in Ontario, Canada, and I actually stepped away from the law in 2019 at the end and came back after a couple of years because I felt like there was some good that I could do. I mean, I was primarily a litigator for most of my career. Um, Quite frankly, I recognize the destruction that our system, our legal system, tended to have. So when I came back, my approach was much different. My practice is now based outside of court. So I'm an accredited mediator. I'm a collaborative professional. I've developed a process that I call principal cooperative negotiation as well, which really starts to explore. It explores things that we'll talk about in this session, things that maybe the court system overlooks, and things that I think that many of the people, having read posts to the comments that you've made, things that people are feeling or going through, things that I know you and Chris have gone through. But before we get started, I mean, I think number one, I'm not enjoying the fact that it's now sweater weather, and it transitioned in like 2 days. But I also wanted to say that, there's a lot going on in the world right now. There's a lot going on in the United States. And I'm really thinking of the people that have been affected by the hurricanes down in Florida, Helen and Milton. And, thoughts from Canada, the love is passing to across the border.
Yeah, thank you.
Not illegally, by the way, not illegally. It's coming appropriately and legally.
Thank you. All right, so David, let's get right into fear. What is fear mongering, and where do you see it the most? And then how does it impact the divorce process? Big question.
Yeah, it is a big question. I mean, as I've kind of analyzed the antecedents of conflict, right? I mean, we start with conflict. I mean, conflict is something that's necessary. It's natural. And quite frankly, it's appropriate because it does help keep the balance. It's our approach to conflict that seems to be problematic and in my view, anachronistic, and it really hasn't evolved. And again, I'll start off by saying I'm not I'm not the type of person that feels the need to be right. This is meant to be reflective. This is meant to be provocative. This is meant to generate conversations. But one of the things that I saw is we have a legal system, and all of the components of the legal system, in my view, when people come to me, they're being led by fear, right? Fear is that core antecedent emotion. And then what we often see coming out of fear, it manifests itself in different ways, right? And again, it's not to excuse the behavior, but it certainly helps us understand. So we have a system that, quite frankly, in my view, um, keeps us sitting in fear, right? Fear of repercussions, fear of consequences, fear of all kinds of things, when it comes to our children, our finances. So, and there's been a culture that's built around this that also keeps people sitting in this perpetual state of fear. I mean, I go online and I get it. People are going through the most difficult circumstances that they ever have, in most cases. Um, Oftentimes, what they're going through is something that they've never experienced. I mean, it's akin to a death of somebody very close to you. The death of the relationship, and we often look for those voices to help us find our way through. And sometimes those voices aren't necessarily the best helpers, which is why, again, Lisa, I love to promote the work that you do, because the work that you do helps me do my work, do my job better. But the legal system itself, when we think about it, is supposed to help people. And I say this, I have a bit of a wry smile on my face. I can see it at the bottom of my screen, but does it really help people in the way that we think it does? I mean, the system itself is its own playground. And that I often say that the legal system is not necessarily built for the people that are going through it. It's built for the professionals that work within it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Lisa, you and Chris have had to navigate this system on your own. And that was a steep learning curve, I have no doubt.
Yep.
And it and again, it keeps people, in that heightened state of emotion, that holy shit, am I going to do something wrong here that's going to seriously impact the rest of my life? Again, this is part of my theory that our approach to conflict hasn't evolved in a way that helps people in the necessary way that it should.
Yeah, and also going through it, it's not just the fear, it's that deep sense of anger and injustice. Like, how could the system that I'm turning to for relief be making things worse? And every day that I have to deal with it, I'm terrified because I don't know what I'm doing and nobody's listening to me and nobody's helping my family.
Well, and I get it. People have this concept of we watch. We're a culture of instant gratification, right? We watch Judge Judy, and everything's wrapped up in 15 minutes.
Mhm.
And I know we've talked about this before, and I think people go into it genuinely thinking that what's going to happen is I'll have my day in court, and eventually you will. But what does it cost? What is the cost of getting there?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And not just
and
financial
again,
cost.
no, 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 no. In fact, the bigger cost is the emotional cost, the cost to the family,
Right.
right? Finance being a small part of that. When I do a lot of mediation, and when I hear people talking to me about, I don't care what it costs, they're always talking about the financial cost. I think as professionals, we can always do a better job to, when I see those reactions from people, what I do as a professional is I lean in. And one of the things that I wish we would start teaching at a younger age is noticing our own emotions. Part of the reason why we remain in that perpetual state of fear is because we don't know how to unravel it. We don't know how to navigate through it. So what often happens is we stay in that perpetual state of fear and we delegate it to somebody else. Now I think about, and again, full disclosure, I've had an opportunity to reflect on how I've evolved as a professional. And I remember the times when people would come to me and I'm ticking off the boxes, right? Okay, so we're going to look for sole custody and supervised visits, and I'm building the narrative in my head, and I'm simply asking that person to just answer my questions. Don't give me extraneous information. Just stick to this, so that I could construct that narrative as I'm going. And when you recognize, and I was successful in the trials that I did. It's funny how it's a generational thing. The lawyers before me in the previous generation, it always seemed like they were always going to trial, but trials really are very limited. When we look at the scope of things that go to trial, cases that go to trial, it's 95 to 99% of cases are resolved before they ever get there.
And
Right?
that's the part you don't hear about on social media, right? You don't often hear about the cases that succeed outside of court, which we know really helps the family in terms of not the conflict not bleeding as much onto the children, because litigation is super stressful.
Well, in litigation, this approach to conflict tends to, I guess, in a way, promote poor behavior, right? You and I were talking when we were uh, doing our planning session for this. We were talking about incendiary rhetoric,
Mm-hmm.
and I think the best place that we've seen in the United States and in Canada of that incendiary rhetoric, that I'm going to say whatever to evoke, elicit, and engage these emotions, most of which are negative, um, and cause people to jump to action. And we see that mostly in politics, but honestly, when I reflect on it, it came from politics by way of law. Law has, I used to be, again, when you're writing an affidavit, you're using that incendiary language. It's not just they were uncooperative; they were extremely uncooperative, right? To illustrate a point, because again, as a society, we've kind of gotten to this point where you have to really jam it down their throats. You have to escalate and elevate your voice in order for your point to be made.
Yeah,
And
David,
again,
pause
yeah.
for 1 second. Sorry, I'm thinking as you're saying that, just yesterday, and so often when a client comes to us, they are astonished at the motions that opposing counsel has filed and how they personally attacked
Mhm.
the human being, like our client, without even knowing them. And it's like we have to keep explaining that's part of a strategy, but they're like, oh, I can't believe that they're saying these horrible things about me. Like,
Well,
why are they doing that? How can they get away with that? It's terrifying.
yeah, and again, I think I reflect on my legal training, right? Law school. I mean, really, it was about how can you take your case to the Supreme Court of Canada. This reminds me of one quote, and I lead with this a lot. I mean, for those that have heard me speak with Lisa on the Instagram lives before or read the foreword to the book, I've evolved completely as a professional. What I was taught in law school was you don't give in, you never apologize, you always advance, and that never really sat well with me. But I figured I'm a professional. I'm in this. This is how I have to do it. And it took me walking away, and I had transformed my practice when I stepped away from law in 2019. I had transformed it to be out of court, or I was transitioning out of court. I continued to represent children in court because I always, for me, getting their voices heard often led to settlement. if you can do it in a skillful way, it typically led to settlement. But a quote that sticks out in my mind, and I'll attribute it to Robin Schwartz, who wrote a book called The Curse of Cain, which is actually about the violent legacy of monotheism. So it's a religious book, and I don't know how but what emanates from that book is the first act of violence we commit is seeing another as the other, and there's a big difference, right? We have a society that is incapable of civil discourse, and I don't care what side you're on, left, right. It doesn't matter. The incendiary rhetoric, the approach to conflict is so polarized. And again, I've talked about this prospect of, do you need to be right, or do you need to get it right and get on with your life, right? And maybe using right in that second part of it isn't even the correct word to use, right? Do you need to be able to move on? When I have people coming to me, and you can imagine, as a mediator or as a collaborative lawyer where I'm representing one person or principal cooperative negotiation, I get it. People need to vent. There's a lot of emotion. There's a lot to unpack, right? And what we lack as a profession, and maybe even broader as a society, is leading with that emotional intelligence, right? Being able to tap into what is going on with me, to then stop and say, okay, what's going on? Can I label it? What is it? What's causing? And then be able to navigate forward in a meaningful way. And one of the things that I've noticed as a lawyer is lawyers tend to lead with the vitriol, right? Those nasty letters with, your client is this, your client did this. In absolute terms, we never know, right, as lawyers. But when you inject your personal into it, it becomes problematic. So there was an original question here, Lisa, and I know that I kind of deviated, but
I'm used to it with you, David. I'm used to it.
I'm trying to take it back to that original
Well,
point.
actually, it was 3 questions.
Okay.
So it was about fear mongering, where you see it, and how it affects divorce proceedings or post. But it is like you have answered it, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. We have a bit of time here, and I'm sure that but again, what I see in the system and so I think where I was going is, as a mediator, as a collaborative lawyer, people need to be able to have that unload with me, right? And one of the things that I've become much more skilled at, although not perfect, none of us are, it's a work in progress, it always is. But one of the things that I do is I'm able to help them identify the emotions. I then, rather than repel, oh my goodness, I'm dealing with this emotion, I don't want to deal with this emotion, you lean in, ask some more questions, help me understand, identify different things, and then that critical question that's, uh, I'm very led by, so now what? All right, let's assume even though as a mediator, as your lawyer, I'm not an adjudicator, right? I'm there to help you navigate through and have difficult conversations. But let's assume I've accepted everything you have to say. So now what? And Ken Cloak, who's a brilliant mediator in the United States, a person whose work um, I try to follow. His question is, so where do we go from here? And people aren't often thinking of that. They're stuck in the quagmire of the emotion. And as a professional, I often say, if I step into your muck, what does that do? I might get stuck and I'm not able to help pull you out of it. But if I stay out of it, I can let you process through how you need to and help you process through it, and then be able to lend a hand to pull you out when you need it
Yeah.
from me.
So as a lawyer or mediator, you have to be emotionally regulated yourself to
Yeah.
lead people through their fear. I was going to also say, we talked about how fear, people often feel like, oh, I shouldn't be afraid, I feel so weak. Do you remember how we talked about fear connecting to being weak, or a perception of being weak?
Well, yeah, and I think there's a lot of things that get attributed to weakness. For example, any attempt at being vulnerable um, is often perceived as weakness. The court system is all about power and strength. It's about going in there and telling your story in a way that will allow that adjudicator, that arbiter, to side side with you, you know. And again, you may win in that circumstance, but then life goes on and emotions continue to evolve. Compassion is often seen as a form of weakness, right? Leading with compassion, leading with vulnerability, kindness, and empathy. If you ask a room full of people whether these are qualities that you think a good human being, because again, remember this process and how we approach conflict is meant to dehumanize, right? Seeing an other as the other. That's the core of dehumanization. Taking accountability or being responsible for our actions has kind of a dual. It's seen as a weakness, but it's also potentially in a legal justice system going to have consequences, right? So this is where we often see, again, we see it in the public eye, the doubling down, the tripling down, quadrupling down, and then when that doesn't work, we go into an ad hominem personal attack, right? There's a
Mm-hmm.
formula to it. And again,
Yeah.
because we're taught as a society, that's weakness. You can't admit that. You can't
Right.
ever.
But
Go ahead.
outside of the courtroom,
Mhm.
in negotiation, which can be in mediation, or we teach strategic communication where someone's communicating directly with their ex, there are ways to use compassion and empathy as a strength, right? It's like you have much more of an
Absolutely.
ability to do that, and you can often get a lot further. So when people are saying, I don't even want to try it, they're really missing out on an opportunity because they think, oh, it's never going to work.
And sometimes it's as simple as you have somebody, and I get it. So let's make sure that I understand. Um, I'm a conflict resolution professional, but I also understand that when you're caught in your own conflict, it is difficult and sometimes feels like it's impossible to pull yourself out and be that person, that third person, because we're always trying to look at things of, okay, so I'm stuck in this, but how would you advise your best friend or your closest relative if they were going through it? I would definitely commend to anybody that's listening that's caught in that difficult situation. I know you've done some research. Bill Eddy's research is fantastic. So, for example, he uses ear responses, empathy, attention, and respect, right? And I've seen in very animated situations where I'm opposing counsel, where I've said to the other individual, I use this in mediation as well. I can tell that this is, and oftentimes you try, I can tell that this is upsetting to you. And if it's not, if upset is not the right word, that person will correct you, but you immediately feel the temperature go down,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then you're able, because when people are in that heightened state, their brain is hijacking everything. So you're not able a lot of times to regulate, and people aren't taught how to regulate themselves. That's one of the things that I do as a professional is try and help people understand. Okay, you have an emotion there. That's okay. Having an emotion, but recognize it, notice it first, identify it, and then, give it that space that it needs, lean in and ask yourself some questions, and that's what leads to the empowerment. And I get it. I understand what you're saying, Lisa. A lot of people say, well, it can't happen. But if they actually do take the time, I find the people that are most responsive to it find that it's very, very effective, and they want to learn more because they're like, wow, it's not magic. It's being able
Psychology.
well, it is, and it's science. It's brain
Yeah.
science too. Neurophysiology and neuropsychology, but it's antithetical to how we're taught.
Right.
We're often taught to just lead by emotion, right? And when we lead by emotion, that's what's created. I'll go off on a bit of a tangent here. This week I watched the Mr. McMahon documentary about one of my guiltier pleasures in my younger years was watching pro wrestling.
Mm-hmm.
And the Mr. McMahon character, and they talked about the development, the arc of that character. And, you know, as a society, we made a pivot at some point where Howard Stern, and again, this isn't that shock value, right? Jerry Springer. Um, it went from being accepted to being expected. All of a
Mm.
sudden, that behavior is expected, and we're seeing the collateral damage that's done. It's almost like, Lisa. It's life imitating art.
Mm-hmm.
This shock value thing came out, and we were reacting to it. This is great, and then all of a sudden, people stopped censoring themselves, and they just felt that if I have an opinion, no matter what it is, no matter how ill informed I may be on the subject, I am entitled, another bad word, to give it, right? And so, again, that's all part of this dehumanization process. How do we, and again, these are, we're not going to resolve this in the half hour or hour that you and I are talking, but these are conversations that in my view we need to be having, right? And it's not, again, it's not, I don't have the answers. I have some thoughts, I have some theories, but we need to continue the conversation. That's how we're going to move forward.
Yeah. One of the people that you referenced, Bill Eddy, we love him. We love his book Splitting and other books that he's written. But something that I read recently that he talked about are positive and negative advocates. And he was saying that we have to be really careful because often we unknowingly surround ourselves with negative advocates, meaning people who love us and support us, but are kind of inflaming the conflict, where they're like, you should get this, you deserve this, like extreme thinking. And that we really need to make sure, especially with the professionals involved with these cases, high conflict cases, to have positive advocates, people who are emotionally self-regulated, people who can kind of step back and say, like you said, David, like what comes next, what's going to be the impact on the entire family or on the children if we proceed, if we keep going in this direction, you know.
Yeah, and Lisa, we were talking, that's reminding me that we were talking about social media too, right?
Mhm.
Social media, and people are well intentioned. They're going through their own set of circumstances. I see a lot of conflating, a lot of blurring of the lines that your situation is the same as mine, but it's that sympathy, right?
Mhm.
And that sympathy keeps people in that state of heightened emotion, which again, the core emotion that's operating at that point is fear,
Mhm.
right? And I see it happen, and it becomes like this mob, this pack mentality that just takes over.
Mhm.
And you know, I'm careful with what I take in on social media now because it can be everything that we're taking in, it seems, is meant to emotionally manipulate us in some way. I mean, even when we watch television, even the most benign things. For example, you watch television, you watch, you know, the home improvement networks, right? And in those shows, it's, I have to question at one point, I'm like, what is this really doing? Is it telling me that I don't have enough?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. We're seeing this beautiful renovation project, but it's really pointing the finger at you, and you can have this if you really try. And it's keeping people not knowing whether they're coming or going.
Yeah. Exactly. What you were talking about, also scrolling social media and stuff, like one of the things we see happen a lot is what we call doom scrolling. People follow these accounts, we're all about like trying to do better with family court and try to protect ourselves and our children, but there's a number of accounts that will keep publishing really terrifying stories,
Yep.
mostly terrifying stories of what has happened in family court, where the people come out with the sense that everyone is biased, the courts never help truly protective parents, that everything is wrong, and it gets this mindset. And a lot of people find us in this state where they're like, well, I'm going to lose my kids because
Yep.
because I saw this happen, or my kid's going to be killed and my ex is abusive, and we're just like, you have to stop
Well,
doom scrolling. You have to stop. Look, even books that have come out recently that focus on like how terrible people have done in family court. And I feel like so much of what Chris and I try to do is be like, there's, like we talked about earlier, like 95 to 99% of cases settle outside of court. You're seeing the 1%, and even less than that, the extreme disastrous stories. And you're thinking that that's just how it is all the time. And so all this screaming about like the system needs to change, but what actually, it's not going to change. Like it's not going to change during the time that your case is. So people feel like they don't have a sense of agency because it's left up to others. And I feel very strongly, especially with my 10 years in court myself, and I always say like about 100 whatever court appearances, that we can do things ourselves from the bottom up. And then I saw the author, Evan Stark, who's the author of Coercive Control. He unfortunately died a few months ago at a conference. And he said that how he thinks the system will change is on the parties themselves. It's on us to come into court and present compelling cases, really strong cases, to get through to judges who make these orders. And I've seen that happen with my own case. Like a judge that in my head I thought, oh no, this was involved with Jennifer's Law, that I gave testimony, like I'm going to be doomed. Completely the opposite. It wasn't at all what I expected. I saw the impact that my testimony had. I ended up getting incredible orders with teeth. I was given more than I even asked for. And so feeling that impact, and as a pro se, as a self-represented litigant, single, woman, my ex is rich. Like I know everyone says, oh, if your ex is rich, they're the money spouse you're going to lose in court. Not true. But when do you hear stories like that about people who are successful on their own in family court that actually do well without like destroying their lives and burning through all of the money,
well,
but so back to the whole thing with the doom scrolling, it's like, there's not everything is like that. There's a lot of stories that we don't hear about because those stories, well, we know the line, what bleeds is what leads.
Yeah.
And so,
well, and that's part of that Jerry Springer mentality that I was talking about. What bleeds is what leads, but the reality is what was once accepted is now expected, right?
yeah.
But to your point, it appalls me when I see lawyers out there producing information that is meant to induce fear.
Right.
And I've seen a number of lawyers that make people think that the world is going to cave in on you. One of the things when I reflect on the behavior of my profession in the legal system, I hear a lot about how it wants to get better. I hear a lot about how we can do better, we can be better as a profession, but yet I watch the behavior and I think it's afraid to get better. I think it's afraid to start tapping into things like brain science because there's a fear that will be irrelevant, that somehow who I am as a professional is tied to how skillfully I can argue. The reality is even Lisa, with you going through court and your success is wonderful. It demonstrates to people that they can do it on their own.
It was
There's
painful
always,
though. It was not, it's just
well,
like not a fun journey.
and honestly, Lisa, the story is still not completely written yet. You know, things could turn in a way with unpredictability, and there may be another chapter that you're going to be talking about a year from now. It seems to self perpetuate, right? One of the reasons I walked away from litigation was a I saw the destruction that the system had. It didn't do things in a kind and compassionate way, right? And I get it. That's what it's there for. There are adjudicators. The lawyers typically weren't kind. I can remember, um, my behavior, my reactions to submissions being made by other counsel and the huffing and the dropping of the pen, those overt gestures. And why are we doing them? Well, you want the judge to notice that you're outraged, but you can't necessarily stand up and object. So there are these behaviors that we. But the other reason was I got tired of the. Imagine, Lisa, in the cases where I did have a trial and a final decision was made, and it was never over. It was a revolving door, right? So when I hear the system say we need to get better, we need to invest in these things, and there are some initiatives that are being undertaken um, to improve it, I still think that the system itself has this underlying fear. This fear, if we do improve to a point where people are able to communicate properly with one another, appropriately with one another, or effectively with one another, that somehow we won't be relevant anymore. Right?
Yeah.
I and again, just a theory that I have, but I've been observing this for a long, long time, and I remember saying to people, well, yeah, the system is difficult and people don't necessarily come out of it better, but it's the system that we have, right? And so we need to follow this course. It's just interesting. I mean, I'm very much at a point in my career where I'd like to open up these conversations more. But the necessary part of this conversation, the person that needs to be at the table, are people like you that have navigated it both with a lawyer and without, been able to observe. I mean, you had to learn the language. It was like learning Greek, no doubt, when you stepped into a courtroom on your own. All of a sudden, we, as lawyers, we're taught we just throw these terms around, right? This is just part of the vernacular, and yet, is it really? Because people don't talk. I review some of the contracts that I've drafted, and I'm like, my God, you know, in the past, I look at them and I'm like, how can anybody possibly understand this? Because it's layered with so much legalese.
Mhm.
And I know that there's a movement towards plain language. California is doing some wonderful things, as they tend to do. One of the things we talked about humanization is Woody Moston was talking about a law that was enacted that will get away from the labeling, get away from the applicant and respondent or plaintiff and defendant, and actually use names. My God, it took it took a creation of law. I mean, it seems to make so much sense. And, Woody is somebody that I have a tremendous amount of respect for. And, as mediators, we don't think twice. I tend not to use language like clients. It's the individual's name when there's communication going on. But the language of law that we're taught is that dehumanizing language. So, it was great to see when Woody posted it, and I think he was commending somebody else for the work that they had done on it, but it was how refreshing. I mean, the law's been going on for so long, and we're saying, wow, how refreshing is it that we're actually calling people by their name rather than labeling them.
I know, because nobody wants to be called the defendant.
but I'll take it. Listen, however slowly, and I recognize that my career is going to be done before perhaps some of these larger shifts are made. But if I can help contribute to that conversation right now, that human conversation, because everybody that you're helping is a human being. And yet, if you were to peel back the layers, most, if not all of them, feel anything but. They feel like they're being controlled, right? Whether
Yeah.
it's by their former spouse or whether it's by a system that just simply sees them as, you know, a necessary step in doing their job. You
Yeah.
know, it's unfortunate.
Yeah.
People have the power. You're right. The people have the power to change how this system is done, and that's to Julie McFarland's research. She was a professor of mine at the University of Windsor, taught me mediation when mediation wasn't a course that we could take. I had to take a weekend mediation course when I was in law school, and I won't say how long ago it was, but judging by my hairline, people can probably tell that I'm a bit older. And you
David,
know,
you and I are, I think we're the same age, so
yeah,
don't
you've
do that.
aged much better than I have, Lisa. But Julie has led the National Self-Represented Litigants Project based out of Canada, but the research that they do, I think, is worldwide and focuses a lot on the statistics in North America, so the United States and Canada, and it's remarkable, right? And when
Didn't
I
you
read
tell me
that,
it's like three out of four people are self-represented?
that was is somewhere between 70 and 80%. And that was, that's when I read the book, and the book was in it wasn't the first edition. It was, I can't remember if it was a second or third, and the research is ongoing.
Yeah.
People are opting to not go to court with lawyers, but that's not necessarily the answer, right?
No, it's not. But sometimes for some people, like for me, it's the only choice.
Yeah.
And sometimes with their clients when they're like, I don't know what else to do. And I'm like, well, instead of giving up, at least you could try to go pro se, but you need to learn a lot of strategies. You can't just walk in there like you're gonna like I could do
But
just as well as an attorney. There's a lot to learn
let
with
me
that. And
let let me throw this out to you, though. One of the theories that I'm really trying to get my head around is the fact that our approach to conflict, I mean, at our age, Lisa, it is what it is. This is what we know. But can you imagine that if fundamentally, right, we teach math, we teach science, we teach English and everything else, but fundamentally, if we stopped referring to these things as soft skills, if we started referring to these things as necessary skills,
mhm.
and conflict management and emotional intelligence
And healthy
and self-regulation,
relationships.
healthy
Right.
relationships. I mean, there is so much that we can explore, and and I think what we would do is we'd embed it for a generation so that conflict and things like that, different things, can be approached much differently,
Much
right?
sooner. I mean, look
Yeah.
at how much money businesses spend on coaching their employees to work as a team or to get along and conflict resolution. Like, why does it have to wait till then for people to
Well,
learn how if they work in that particular company?
yeah, you're right, Lisa. Like, I mean, the skill set can be taught, but again, we'd have to invest fundamentally in early childhood evolution. It's not just education, because and this is where I've talked to you about establishing who you are as a person. What are your values, right? But not just doing it when you find yourself in a legal proceeding. If we understand who we are at a young age, that will lead to healthier relationships, because we actually understand who we are, what we want, what our objectives are, not just in a moment, but in life. I, again, I didn't necessarily expect the conversation to turn this way, but
Oh, it always
there are
goes.
such there are broader conversations, Lisa, that I think if we took a step back and observed, William Ury is another, I keep name dropping, but these are people who are influential in my life. And Bill Ury is Harvard mediator. He's like one of the tops. For me, he and Ken Cloak are gurus of what they do. And that's where Bill Ury talks about, zooming in, zooming out. He talks about the third side, right? That there's one side, there's the other side, there's also the third side, which is a more collective. It may be societal, it may be community based, and it's just very interesting. I mean, I would definitely say that I one of the books that I've just read is called Possible by Bill Ury, and it's have it sitting next to me, How We Survive and Thrive in an Age of Conflict, and he talks about how we have our finger on the button of conflict all the time now, and we go from zero to mushroom cloud combustibility immediately, right? And we're not slowing things down. And he, in a very human and understandable way, talks about the importance of possibility and how we can, if we approach things from the possible as opposed to the conflict. And the human, it very much talks about the humanization. It's tough because this shit has been ingrained in us for generations and generations and generations. And it's tough to clear all that stuff out.
Yeah.
It's like living in a house for 50 years and then you go to move and it's like, holy crap, look at all the stuff that I have.
Oh, I don't think
It's
that happens to everyone.
yes.
50 years, 5 years. Yeah. So as we're talking about how, and I love what you said about we should stop looking at these things as soft skills and see them as necessary and start with educating people on that as soon as possible. I was thinking back when my kids went to high school, they had a debate class and the debate teacher was amazing, but he had this thing that they would do after school called the Franklin Forum, and they would pick these really provocative topics. And then they'd invite some professors, some students, people from the community to have discussions about them, and then debates themselves, which both my kids did. My son did more than my daughter, but that was such an awesome skill that he learned, because it's like you can take one really inflammatory topic, argue it hard from one side in a civil way, and then you have to flip and argue the same topic from the opposite point of view and do it in a respectful, logical manner. And I think it really, I think it really helps develop people as human beings to be able to argue civilly.
Mm-hmm.
And separate themselves from the issue. And there's just we don't have that when, like, everything, like we said, when it comes to family court, everything is like a personal attack instead of like, okay, here's an issue that needs to be solved.
Yep.
Let's figure it out. I mean,
well,
the custody schedule, we got to figure it out.
And that's what William Ury will say. It's separating the people from the problem, right? We conflate both, and that's just naturally how we've learned to do it. And I completely agree, Lisa. To be able to have discourse, and I think about some of the other influences I have right now. Jonathan Haidt and the work that he's done, Mark Manson and the work that he's done, talking about creating space to have these difficult conversations rather than saying that subject makes me uncomfortable, so we can't have that conversation.
I'm so scared of this person, I'm not even gonna even begin to start figuring out how I can try to tackle this problem.
Yeah, or it could be things that challenge the beliefs that I hold, and not wanting to have those conversations because we deem it uncomfortable to have those conversations. Well, guess what? If we don't have those conversations, the conflict's going to bottle up, and it's like, shaking that 2-liter of Coke, and at some point that lid's going to blow off, and it's going to be much more combustible than if you're having these discussions along the way. There are so many minds out there that, again, it's not whether I agree with them or not, but they're provocative to me, and they get me thinking about, okay, right? I may not necessarily agree with their view on something, but I'm now thinking about it. And I'm having a conversation about it. And we're building spaces like this, Lisa, where you and I get it, the work that you and I do is kind of focused on that realm of people going through separation and divorce and, you know, the aftermath of it. But there's such a broader context to this that would be beneficial to the entire world. I mean, I spoke at a conference in May, and I was talking about the subject. It was to professionals, so it was family professionals, financial professionals, and legal professionals, and it was about checking in with yourself before you step into a room to assist others, right? And knowing yourself to understand others. And you know, just the fact that we're kind of led by this, we know, but yet oftentimes what I hear lawyers say, you know, that whole, I can't allow my client to do this. And where does that come from? Well, is that coming from, I don't want to appear as weak, which could be one, or I don't want to get sued because this isn't what I agree to. And so what we do is we take control of their lives. And then what people tend to do in that circumstance is they say, well, I couldn't do it because my lawyer wouldn't let me, right? As a lawyer, what I say to individuals is, look, my job is to make sure you have all of the information to make a decision. And if you don't, then we get the information, and to provide you with my perspective, opinion, if you will, about how the law could be interpreted. Because again, it's not would be, it's not black and white, how it could be interpreted. And that means identifying the different ways it could be interpreted, and to make sure that whatever you're agreeing to, you're doing it on your own. Other than that, you're a big boy or you're a big girl. You can do what you want to do. I also tease out with people things like, what are your objectives? What are your values? I need to know that because that helps me focus you in the conversation. But I had said at this conference, I was asked to speak at the end on a panel, and I talked about how we're at this critical point, I think, in human history, where I think communication is at its worst. We don't have the ability to hold space for the other. We've othered everybody, and that's what we tend to do. And we go to that, and that's our safe space. And when we do that, we don't leave any room for discourse, right? You know, we see it, we're seeing it on both sides of the border here in the United States and in Canada in politics, right? It's not about what are you going to do to help the people. It's how can I tap into the emotion to make them, and it's a form of manipulation. I'll tap into their fear so that they then, I have them in that heightened emotional state. They're going to do what I want them to do, right? It's so disingenuous, and it's so, you know, again, it's caused me to not really take in, I try not to watch any media anymore because it just it in a way it infuriates me because everybody's kind of being led in that direction, and there's a simpler way to have that communication, have it respectfully, not I disagree, um, you know, double down, triple down, quadruple down, and then, you know what, you're an asshole.
Like I'm not listening anymore because I disagree. We're done.
Well, but then it turns to when it appears that there is evidence there to support maybe another view, then it turns into a personal attack. Or you're just dumb. Right?
Yeah, yeah. So, of course, David, have gone almost an hour, and let's end it with some ideas of how to get out of this fear. So we talked about a few ideas, but I know that you talked about when you negotiate with people that you like getting things done in small chunks. Can you talk about that a little?
I get that the people that we help, Lisa, sometimes feel like they can't do it in small chunks because to do it in small chunks would be costly. You know, one of the things that we can do getting back to the emotion is notice what's going on within yourself, give it that space, name it, lean into it, ask the questions. That leads to empowerment with yourself. It's also transposable. I mean, these are also skills that when we notice somebody else, once we do it with ourselves, we can then employ the strategy with someone else, like Bill Eddy talks about, and that's when we lean in a bit and ask those questions. Ask yourself, what are my objectives? What are my values? What does success look like to me?
Yeah, David, you,
Often,
you said something like, if today were a good day, what would tomorrow look like?
well, and that's a question that I ask in mediation a lot, right? Especially when people are struggling. I prep them for the mediation session, and they come in, and invariably the emotions get the better of them because they're caught in it. And rather than say, you know what, guys, that's it, we're separating you, or stop acting like that. I mean, I have certain communication guidelines, but what I'll do is the first question I may ask is, okay, guys, you've asked me, because I've already identified with them what their values are. You've asked me to play this role. Is this helping? Like, do you need me in the room? If you guys want to keep arguing, it's expensive for me to be here. The other thing that I'll then turn to is, you know what? Let's look at, if today was a good day, what would tomorrow look like? It's about getting them thinking forward. It's tough for us when we're caught in that emotional state. We're not looking forward. We say we are. We'll always refer back to, but Lisa, you did this.
The blame.
Right?
It's not
And
resolution focused. So staying like resolution focused. Okay, so this happened, but we have to keep figuring out what to do, like what to do to get out of here.
Well, and that's where that question, and we do live in a cycle of blame. We have comfort in feeling, but again, that's where that question comes out, Lisa, that, okay, let's assume I accept everything you have to say. And this person did this, and they're to blame. So now what? Where do we go from here? Where do you go from here? Take out the we. Where do you go from here? And there's a lot of work that needs to be done. This is the breaking down in the smaller chunks. Sometimes is an alert to me as a professional, making sure. But take breaths along the way. Check in with yourself. Right?
Pause.
Yeah, it's okay to do. Right? Wherever you are, whether it's a negotiation, take those moments, because otherwise, it's like a tsunami, and it'll drown you. And so reminding people, I do that a lot when I do consultations, take those moments, take those pauses, break things into smaller digestible chunks. This is work that I'm sure that you and Chris do with people before they even go to the lawyers, because that's what
say, like, you like to even think about like what it is you're looking for, because a lot of times people will just keep spiraling around what happened, and I'm like, I understand, but like let's also start thinking, because we don't want you to start spending tons of money telling other people.
Being able to ask yourself the why. Why often coming from us to another person can seem like a defensive question that would elicit a defensive response. Oftentimes, what I'll ask is what. So what about that is important to you, right? And if we can teach people to start being able to do that to emotionally regulate themselves, you're better able to navigate through even the most difficult personality. They're going to be challenging. And the reality is, I've had situations where I've been able to bestow on or help the individual that I'm working with these things, and the other lawyer is just toxic and incendiary, and I get it. I'm there again, not getting stuck in the muck when my client doesn't want to or wants to engage in that. Remind them. Right? I'm able to, by not getting emotionally involved. And a lot of times the lawyers get way too emotionally involved in this stuff.
You're telling me.
Yeah. And
Right.
it comes from a good place. It really does, but it still, it doesn't help that individual. It really doesn't. It gives them an ally. It gives them that negative advocacy.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
David, I hate to say it, but I don't think it comes from a good place with certain people. I
No,
don't know. I don't.
I would agree. I would
Yeah.
agree. But I think by and large, when I reflect on the professionals that I've come across, lawyers that I've come across in my career, I think for most of them it does. But you're
But
right. There are bad
I'm
actors.
talking about the bullies. Like that's
Yeah.
not. It's just awful.
Yeah. But again, Lisa, this is you're taught to win at all costs. I mean, I think we have to change. One of the fundamental changes that needs to happen too is when we're training people in conflict. So training professionals in conflict, it's got to be a different way because what you're taught in law school, I'm sorry, it's zero sum.
Yeah.
It
Yeah. I
is.
mean, that's good to know. You're answering questions that come to us all the time is how could my ex's attorney behave like that? How could they be so well, now you have it because you're taught.
Yeah.
That's the strategy.
And I think it's also how the system is set up too. The system is set up as a zero sum system. It's an adversarial system. I get it. You've come across them. Everybody's come across them. The judges that seem to have the sense and say, guys, you know what? You both have good lawyers. Surely you can figure this out. You both seem like intelligent people, and surely you can figure this out. But the problem is, from the moment that you start in court, it's not about starting from a place of, okay, what can we agree on? It's starting from a place of, I'm launching a lawsuit, right?
Mhm.
And I'm not encouraged to give any compassion or empathy to the other person. It's all about what's the worst thing this person has done, and then we'll multiply it by 100 times,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It's so like, and then to tell people once you've gotten them emotionally enmeshed in that, to then say, well, you have to go to mediation.
I
To
know.
me, it's idiotic. It's just idiotic. And I get it. I've had all kinds of conversations with professionals, and I know I'm sounding very definite. I'm always open to having conversations, but when I've tried to have some of these conversations with some of my colleagues, I get here are the 10 things wrong with what you're saying. Oh, that's fantastic, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's that Einstein thing. He makes one mistake, and he asks people, "What did you observe?" And most people point out the one mistake. He goes, "What about the 99 things I got right?"
Mhm.
That's not how we're trained. We're trained to be critical, not critical thinkers. We're trained to just be critical, and it's almost like it's a contrarian mentality.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, I think a big part of winning or being successful is trying to keep as much out of the court system,
Well,
doing what we can outside in terms of negotiating, and it is hard, and it's
yeah,
just a different kind of process. It's not allowing other people to make those big decisions unless you absolutely have to.
and there are circumstances, Lisa, where it does need to be made by another person.
I know.
If
How many days was I in court? I know.
if
I
if
know.
we're if we're wrapping up, and I think we are, I'd love to leave everybody with a quote that's had an impact on
Yeah.
me more recently. It's a William Ury quote, and he said, "This is the hardest work we human beings can do, to face our fears and listen to others with whom we disagree. In my experience, the hardest work is done by the parties. It is much easier to remain at a distance, casting stones at the other. It takes real courage to face the pain of human differences.
Mm.
It takes courage to talk with vulnerability about what really matters." And one of the things that one of the journeys that I'm on right now, is exploring the path to peace by leading with vulnerability. Um, and there is a place for it. Societally, we say, no, that's weakness. That's fine. I've never been the one to necessarily go with the flow. So I thank you for having me on to have this conversation, because I think it's a broader, more important conversation that I think hopefully resonates with the people that are listening. But I know that you and I will definitely continue this.
Of course. So how can people find you, David?
So my website is davidmorneau.com. And you can get a hold of me through that. My email address is info@davidmorneau.com. That's DAVIDMORNEAU.com.
Yes. And the recovering litigator on Instagram.
The recovering litigator on Instagram is the other way you can get a hold of me. And I'm on LinkedIn and everything too.
Yeah.
I'm
All
just
right,
not on X because I have my own personal reasons for why I deleted that account.
that's okay. All right. Well, thank you.
Existential reasons.
I bet. Thank you so much, David. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and we'll be in touch soon.
Okay.
And hope you recovered from your concert last night.
Oh, you know what? Anybody that gets a chance to see the Doobie Brothers, they sound. One of the things that Andrea is very big on, my wife, is I don't like going to concerts because they never sound like the albums. She's like, oh my God, they sound exactly like the albums, and they're 70-something years old now.
Wow.
They could still kick it. Yeah, they were great.
Good. All right. Well, I'll talk to you soon, David.
All right, Lisa. Take care.
Bye. You too.
Bye.